Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring you curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I'll be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we take an up-close look at the tallest Christmas tree in the Twin Ports. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Joining me on this journey to the top of a CHS grain elevator in Superior is arts and entertainment reporter Jay Gabler. Jay, welcome back.
Good to be here, Wyatt, as always.
Yeah, for this year's rendition of a holiday-themed episode last year, you had two holiday-themed episodes last year. One was the Dayton holiday figures and Cane Lakes candies, and then we kind of did a throwback of sorts with the Marshall Hales lights. And now we're going much, much higher off the ground than the lights previously discussed on the podcast a year ago.
Yeah, 270 feet off the ground we stood. This is one of the more extreme interviews I've ever conducted, just in terms of the conditions under which the interview happened. You and I, Wyatt, were just chatting before we started recording about bear grease, and going back to bear grease a couple years ago, standing out, near midnight at a checkpoint on a frozen lake, waiting for the dogs in bitterly cold conditions, trying to interview people. That was maybe a little bit more extreme in terms of just objective conditions, but standing 270 feet above the Duluth Superior Harbor in December and conducting an interview under those circumstances was certainly a very Twin Ports journalism experience. And shout out to Dan Vanden Hooten, who accommodated us and very generously took time to talk all about the Christmas tree at the top of the CHS grain elevator.
Mm-hmm. And what specifically prompted you to pursue this as, I'm not sure if you're intending to do a holiday-themed episode, but for you to pursue this particular Northlandia? Was it just you driving along and seeing the lights up there, like, oh, I should do that? Or was there something else that prompted you?
To be completely honest, I had not consciously noticed the lights on the top of the grain elevator before, although of course I've driven across the Blatnik Bridge many times, like anyone who lives in the Twin Ports. But I knew I had a Northlandia coming up that was going to be timed to the holiday, and we had so much fun last year going to Cane Lakes. We even got a Christmas card, Wyatt and I did, with a little poem the Cane Lakes sisters wrote, and had it laminated and everything. So that was a very warm and fuzzy experience. I thought, well, all right, there's got to be another great Christmas Northlandia. I feel like Christmas itself is just kind of a holiday that lends itself to weird traditions and observances. I'm like, there must be another great Christmas story. And so this year I thought, all right, last year we went up to Virginia, up on the range. This year, maybe a little bit closer to home. There must be something interesting involving Christmas around the port, shipping, the lake. So I tried a couple of different avenues. I asked whether, for example, there are any special holiday traditions, including the sailors who are in Duluth, potentially from other countries around the world. And the answer is no. I mean, they're cared for, but it's not necessarily in a particularly interesting or quirky way. It's just, okay, yeah, we support them. Similarly, do the employees of terminal facilities have any, great Christmas traditions? Well, they get a turkey, which is nice, but not necessarily a fascinating or quirky or interesting story. And then one of our colleagues pointed out, well, there is the Christmas tree on top of the grain elevator in Superior, and actually there's one in Duluth as well. But we decided to go up to the top of the CHS grain elevator in Superior and learn how it comes to be that this massive industrial shipping facility makes a little room for the holiday spirit every year.
Mm-hmm. And before we get into too much about the Christmas tree itself, let's talk about the building/structure beneath the Christmas tree. Let's establish what we're talking about here. What is the CHS grain elevator and what's its purpose?
I think if you'd told me in one of those CAPTCHA, are you a human checks, click all the pictures of grain elevators, I think I could have done as well as just say okay, I know what a grain elevator looks like before doing this story, but I had not really given much thought to how it works, why they call it a grain elevator, and we don't need to, for the purposes of this podcast, go too deeply, nor could I still, into the workings of grain elevators, but they are the tall structures that look like a conglomeration of cylinders that are stacked vertically, and the name elevator comes from the fact that there is an elevator mechanism that carries the grain up to be stacked in these silo-like structures where it is stored, typically in the process of being shipped from one place to another. So the CHS grain elevator is one of the big grain elevators over on the Superior side of the harbor. I learned a little something about CHS, the company. It's well, you know what? I'll let Dan Van Den Houten explain what CHS is and what the CHS grain elevator is. It was one of the first questions we asked him.
This facility is owned by CHS, which is the largest agricultural farmer cooperative in the United States. What we do is we bring grain in from all across the upper Midwest and Canada. We bring that in on rail cars to our facility. We unload that grain, whether it's spring wheat or durum. We unload it into our facility, and then we will either load it onto ocean-going vessels going to Europe and Northern Africa, or put it back onto rail cars back to the domestic market.
So the grain elevator is part of the rail sail connection in the Twin Ports that historian Tony Dierkens, who comes up often in this series, mentions is really what helps define the shipping infrastructure of the Twin Ports. Is you've got that connection between the train lines and the vessels that go out to the lake, and in most, if not at least many, if not most cases, in terms of ships loading at CHS, actually are ocean-going vessels shipping a lot of grain overseas. But CHS is a company founded in 1931 as the Farmers Union Central Exchange, later became Cenex Harvest States after a merger, and now is just known as CHS. So I learned that for most of the life of this grain elevator, which started being built in the 1930s and officially opened in the early 1940s, it was known locally as the Farmers Union Terminal. So now we just call it the CHS grain elevator.
Gotcha. And did you ever expect yourself to ever be venturing up a grain elevator? Because that was quite the experience that you, myself, and photographer Jed Carlson went along in that cold December night.
I do not know that I ever thought that I would have reason professionally as an arts and entertainment journalist to visit the top of a grain elevator anywhere, much less on the Duluth Superior Harbor in December. That was certainly a unique experience. When I learned that could be a possibility, I was like, oh yeah, I absolutely want to add that to my bucket list and then check it off. Mm-hmm.
And it was quite the experience climbing up the narrow metal ladders. We took an elevator up there for a bit, but then, we had to venture up some stairs. I feel like I made the mistake of having my video camera and tripod already out. That made it for a tricky climb. I don't usually get afraid of heights at all. I felt a little like, oh, okay, this is like I could drop my camera or I could slip. Like I gotta be careful. It was quite the experience climbing up to it. I actually felt better on the top of the tower than actually like climbing up it, if that made any sense at all. But it was quite the unique experience. And I've had a lot of interesting shoots that I've done working in news over the years, and that's now up there.
Yeah. And, Dan took good care of us in terms of taking all the necessary safety precautions. We had vests, we had head protection, we had eye protection. But it is certainly a working, shipping facility that is not, was not built for tourists or journalists to just go pop up to the top. And so, yeah, as you say, Wyatt, it is a little bit of an experience to go through the necessary steps to get up there. We learned about grain dust, which I guess it is obvious that if you are moving a lot of grain through a space, it's going to produce a lot of dust. But I hadn't really thought about that. I've learned I'm not allergic, apparently, which is
we're all good. We're all good.
Good to know. Yeah, so you get in the facility, you're moving through what we learned is a relatively modest amount of grain dust that they happen to have at that time. They were loading a vessel, the Joanna G, a ship headed off to Italy with a shipment of spring wheat? Yes, spring wheat. So I'm learning about this. Anyway, yeah, so we had to go in an elevator up to the top of the elevator, the human elevator to the top of the grain elevator, and then there were stairs, and then finally a little ladder to get to the top of the head house, which I've learned is so called because that is where the head of the elevator machinery is stored. That's basically where the top of the mechanism that transports the grain up these silos. That's where it's located.
Mm-hmm. Now that we've established what the grain elevator is exactly and how it's utilized, now let's talk about what we're here for, and that's the famed tallest Christmas tree in Duluth. And as we say Christmas tree, really there should be some quotations around it because it's not technically a tree per se. So let's talk about what is actually at the top of the grain elevator. What are people actually looking at?
Yeah, we should put quotes around tree and quotes around tallest. I think the way I ended up formulating the article is that you could call this the Twin Ports' highest Christmas tree if you define it as being something that resembles a Christmas tree, is visible in a public place, and if you measure highest by distance from ground to the top of the tree.
That's a good clarifier, because I guess if you're just listening to it, you might get the misunderstand that we're talking about tallest by like the bottom of where the tree, the light part would begin to the top, but it's just tallest than how it's positioned off the ground, as we talked about near 300 feet off the ground.
Yeah. So other tall or high Christmas trees in the Twin Ports would include, of course, the Bentleyville tree, which goes 128 feet high. It's an artificial illuminated Christmas tree. Bentleyville's own story. You can read all about that at the Duluth News Tribune if you haven't familiarized yourself with what Bentleyville is. And then in terms of being high from the center of the earth, well, Duluth has a big hill. So if you go to the top of Duluth's big hill, there are houses up there. And so anyone who has a Christmas tree in their living room up at the top of the, Duluth
Well,
Hill,
that's kind of like
Duluth Heights.
above sea level or above ground level.
Yeah, that's kind of like if you're thinking like just like sea level, like closest to the stars. You can certainly get higher in the Twin Ports than anything that would start at lake level in the harbor. But I mean, if the Bentleyville tree is 128 feet tall, and that looks pretty tall when you are near it, but you would have to stack another Bentleyville tree on top of the Bentleyville tree, and then you would still only be coming up to near the base of the CHS tree. So technically what it is you go up to the top of the grain elevator, to the top of the head house, so the tallest point on this structure, and there's a flagpole that comes up from the top of the head house. So that adds another 30 feet to what was already 270 feet. So you're hitting a top height of 300 feet there. And then there are 8 strings of LED Christmas lights that come down in a conical formation from the flagpole, so that if you see it from a distance, which is how I would say 99.9999999% of people who have ever seen it have seen it. Very, very few had the opportunity we had, Wyatt, to see it up close and personal. It does kind of look like a tree, and we've learned that everybody just calls it a tree. They don't call it like the CHS grain elevator lights. They say, oh, the Christmas tree at the top of the CHS grain elevator.
Mm-hmm. It's not actually a Christmas tree, and I'd say that it's about 30 feet total in height. From where it actually starts on the grain elevator to the top of the point there.
Yeah. And Dan pointed out that apparently I've only lived in Duluth, as an adult for a couple of years now, so I'm still learning. But Dan pointed out that until just a few years ago, it was actually white lights at the top.
The LED lights is something we put up approximately 5 years ago. And for those longtime followers, we switched to color approximately 2 or 3 years ago with the new LED lights, more energy efficient, and just ultimately gave it more of a different look to the top of the Christmas tree here.
So how did this tradition actually come about? How did it begin?
That was one of the first questions that we asked Dan after we asked him for the history of CHS and the grain elevator. How did this tradition start?
So that's the biggest question we get is about the Christmas lights here. That's always the toughest question of how did it start? Why did it start? Ultimately, talking with former employees and whatnot, this facility, the Christmas lights started around the time the Blatnik Bridge, or at that time the High Bridge, was erected in 1961. And really at that point, I can only guess, the employees at this facility, as part of the cooperative spirit, giving back to the community, wanted to make this more of a epicenter or the staple of people going across the Blatnik Bridge, which is really the main connection between the Superior and Duluth. And they decided what's a better way around Christmas time than put a Christmas tree of Christmas lights up on top of the highest points in the Twin Ports.
So essentially, the tradition dated back to the opening of the Blatnik Bridge, the older of the 2 high bridges, and a bridge that was originally just called the High Bridge, crossing the St. Louis River estuary, the Duluth Superior Harbor to get from Superior to Duluth. The Blatnik Bridge, again, then known as just the High Bridge, opened in the early 1960s. Actually, it opened at Christmas time. It opened it officially in December 1961. And so you've got this grain elevator that had been there for a couple of decades, but now that people are driving or potentially walking, I don't know how easily you could ever walk across the Blatnik Bridge, or if you could ever bike across it like you now can across the Bong Bridge. But anyway, people are certainly driving across the Blatnik Bridge, and this brings them in, it gives them a very different view of the top of the Superior grain elevators and the Duluth grain elevators than they had beforehand. And I went back and looked at our archives, which are now newly accessible digitally, thanks to being archived on newspapers.com. And I went back to our coverage of the opening of the Blatnik Bridge, then known as the High Bridge. It was renamed the Blatnik in the early 1970s. Anyway, it turns out that people were talking about how cool it was to drive across this bridge and how much you could see. And the grain elevators, just in their own right, were considered kind of an attraction, a cool thing you could see. At the time, the CHS grain elevator was described by a News Tribune columnist. I'm not sure how deeply fact-checked this was, but at least one columnist in our newspaper described it as the world's tallest concrete structure. So certainly a very big concrete thing that you can now get a new view on driving across the bridge. And yeah, apparently the good folks at what then would have been known as the Farmers Union decided to give people a little something to look at. It would have been cool if it's been lost to history. It was never, actually, I don't think the tree, in all my searches, I could not find any prior mention at all of this CHS tree in the Duluth News Tribune. So it was not commented upon in the newspaper when they started doing it. So it's a little hard to know unless they have some kind of company records that could conceivably be dug out when exactly the tradition started. But it would be fun to think that apparently Dan's sources tell him it does go back to the early 60s and may even go back to that very first December in 1961 when people could drive across the High Bridge for the first time.
Yeah, and then fun fact about those lights is that they stay up year round just because of the work that it would take to be able to set them up and tear them down. They're not on all year long, but they are positioned up there. They don't take them down and put them back up every year.
Yeah, I mean, one reason it was such an odyssey to get to the top of this grain elevator is that, as we were discussing, in the normal course of operations of the grain elevator, people don't necessarily need to be up there all the time, right? You're in lower levels of the facility, getting the grain moved in, getting the grain moved out, and so it is not common for people just to be hanging out up there and taking care of that area. They do what they need to do to maintain it, but it is on top, above and beyond, so to speak, their normal work to make anything happen up there, certainly anything aesthetically. And so it used to be the case they would actually bring the lights down and then send a flag up the flagpole. But, as Dan pointed out, you work to maintain a flag as well. You want to be respectful to a flag, and people notice if you're not being respectful. So you don't want to just send an American flag up there and then, let it get tattered or whatever. So that becomes its own project. And so they ended up deciding just to leave the Christmas lights up there year round.
Mm-hmm. And is this something that many other grain elevators do? Or is this purely unique to CHS?
I went into this story assuming, well, this is a nice sort of Northlandia story about something that one grain elevator in the Twin Ports does. But assuming that, well, there must be plenty of other grain elevators that do this kind of thing. And I found out researching this story, if this is something that a lot of other grain elevators do, it is not well documented. And as we just mentioned, it's not that it's super well documented even here in Duluth. People have not written or published many articles or comments on the existence of this tree. They just sort of apparently take it for granted. So there may be other Christmas decorations on grain elevators, of which there are thousands in the United States, that just don't get documented or reported upon, so I wouldn't know about them. But I thought it was interesting that as thoroughly as I could search the internet, I really only found a handful of instances of mentions of other grain elevators having any kind of seasonal decoration. It's a little one, here and there, you might have someone, writes out Merry Christmas. Someone might put there's another grain elevator somewhere that has like a tree, but it's kind of like created lights on the side of the grain elevator, like string lights down the side. There's one in the Midwest that used to have this 35-foot cross. But as best I could gather from my web searching, this is not actually a super common thing that people do on grain elevators. And if anything, it was more common in decades past. One reason I would guess is that Christmas is, after all, a religious holiday, and the idea of using any kind of an industrial facility for what could be interpreted as a religious symbol is, probably out of favor now compared to in the past. For example, putting a 35-foot cross up there, it's pretty explicitly religious. Mm-hmm. But also it's work to maintain. I mean, we talked to Dan about the work it takes to maintain even their 8 strands of Christmas lights, which, sounds, that's a lot less than people put on their houses. But just given the conditions, it's hard to maintain that kind of a display. And you have a lot of other things to do when you are maintaining this, this shipping facility. So I would imagine a lot of other grain elevators, the vast majority apparently, are like, you know what, we are going to celebrate Christmas on the ground. Dan did mention there is one other grain elevator in the Twin Ports that decorates for Christmas.
Since we started doing this, one other facility also wanted to take part of the festivities, and I believe that was the Riverland Egg in Duluth. They put up a smaller LED white light Christmas tree as well many years after. Not sure when that started, but it's kind of fun to see how many more elevators, how many other companies can take part of this tradition.
I did send an email to Riverland Egg, that newer grain elevator in Duluth. That one was only built in 1978, so certainly, years after they'd started putting a Christmas tree up on the CHS grain elevator. So we can safely say CHS was the first. And yeah, now if you look at those Riverland Egg elevators, which are pretty visible from much of Duluth, they're kind of right by the base of the Blatnik Bridge there. So they're easy to make out. They're all white. They look like they were built in 1978. And there's a very pristine white Christmas tree that sits on top. So yeah, I did reach out to them and did not hear back with any information about how that tradition got started, how it's maintained, what have you, but it is certainly there. And so now each Twin Port has at least one grain elevator Christmas tree, which is nice to think about.
Mm-hmm. It's funny how, you did your research and are not finding much documentation of other grain elevators with Christmas decorations or holiday decorations of any kind, at least documented, but we have two.
Yeah.
Granted, I don't know how well documented the Riverland one is. I mean, we had mentioned now in this article, but it's great that it's just interesting that the Twin Ports has two of them, which is why maybe we were considered the Christmas city of the North. So, with it now being around for many, many decades now, I imagine there have been some people who have made some comments at some point about the tree.
Yeah, actually, it turns out that people don't say a lot about the tree, not just on social media and in the press, but not necessarily all the time in communications to CHS as well. But Dan told us he has learned that people notice that the tree is there because they notice when it's not there.
In terms of noticing the Christmas lights, I will say, personally, I receive comments not about the Christmas lights, but if they're not on. Last year, we went through a process where our flagpole broke, and we had to replace it. We couldn't hang the Christmas lights until that flagpole was fixed. So the Christmas lights first went on in mid-December last year, which was much later than typical. But I can promise you, if it wasn't daily, it was weekly, getting calls from people around the community saying, hey, don't you know how much that means to me? Are you gonna put your lights up this year? We really wanna see them, we miss them, or we really enjoyed driving past on our way to Bentleyville to see your lights.
Yeah, I can imagine that being one of those things where you may not necessarily notice it all the time when it's there, but then I could see how you can notice if it's not there. Like you're used to seeing lights up there in the wintertime, and then there's just no lights there. That could catch your attention in the reverse kind of way, so to speak.
Yeah, and clearly it is a seasonal landmark for people who are looking for it as a sign of Christmas in the Twin Ports. Christmas city of the North, as you say, is Duluth. I suppose Superior could be the twin Christmas port of the North. But people obviously love Christmas around here and love decorating for Christmas and love seeing decorations. And, Dan said the team there has a discussion every year as to when they're going to plug the lights in. This year, they landed on doing it right around the time of the Christmas City of the North parade, which is essentially the official kickoff to the Christmas season in Duluth. Typically, then Bentleyville turns on the next day, and it's a week before Thanksgiving. So that was when the CHS tree went on this year. And apparently, yes, the lights stay up year round. They don't stay on year round, but they stay on for a long time. If you are a person who feels like you should keep your Christmas decorations up past New Year's, maybe even well into January, the CHS people are with you. Apparently, that tree often stays on into February.
Yeah, so with that, it seems like even though they do leave it up year round, it does something that's still a bit of a hassle, sometimes to manage it, especially when the year prior they did have to fix the flagpole. That was an instance where they definitely had to do some rearranging and probably take them down while they get in the process of replacing it. Are they going to keep doing it?
Yeah, it is a hassle. You have to fix the bulbs. It is, and when you're up there standing in those conditions, you can really appreciate that Sure, today's Christmas lights are pretty robust. The LED Christmas lights, you can whack them around quite a bit and they'll still work, as opposed to the more fragile earlier bulbs. But even these bulbs, it's like those are just some objectively extreme conditions up there. I mean, you're not only
It's way colder up there than on the ground.
oh yeah, I mean, you're not just I mean, anything like outside in the Twin Ports in the winter, that's just already extreme conditions no matter where you are. But yeah, then you go up 270, 300 feet off the ground. It takes some maintenance to keep those lights lit, but the tradition now has been going on for decades, over half a century now. And Dan said it fits the spirit of CHS, which is, after all, a cooperative.
Part of CHS, we're here to empower agriculture, and part of our core values is cooperative spirit. This is one way we feel we can give back to the community, and community involvement is by having simple things like this, Christmas lights on top of our facility, to be part of the community.
So Jay, we've been doing this podcast for almost 2 years now. You know that these episodes tend to end with a question of some form of, why does this fit in the Northland? I know you like to make the case for people or organizations committing to the bit, and I feel like this is kind of an overencompassing of Duluth in general committing to the bit that is the holiday season and Christmas cheer.
Yeah, absolutely. They have been doing this since the early 60s, it seems. And even though it is not something most grain elevators do, once it becomes a tradition for that amount of time, I mean, people already talk about Boobville, Boubville, the kind of alternative Bentleyville celebration that happens. People already talk about that as a tradition now in Duluth, and that's only on its third year. So you can imagine if something's been going on for over half a century, that is absolutely a tradition. And I can only imagine what outcry there would be if they ever just permanently stopped putting these lights up. So yeah, absolutely. Apparently, Duluth and Superior have learned to love this holiday light display, and that absolutely fits in the realm of committing to the bit. I think it's also, Christmas generally, just going hard for Christmas, is something a lot of communities do, but does fit with the Northland culture here. It's tradition, it's community, it's family, it's faith for the believers. And it's a way that you can make the most of a very wintry climate, which is very hard a lot of the time. It's cold. It's, there's crazy precipitation that happens. If you're going to put up with living in such a very wintry place, you might as well enjoy the classic wintry holidays. So being Christmas, and then of course being on the harbor, as the CHS grain elevator is, that really is part of what defines our landscape up here in the Northland, is all that infrastructure that happens to get goods, whether it be grain in this case or other types of materials, or et cetera, moved out to the lake and out to the sea. Any kind of infrastructure like that is very defining and typical for this region. So to have the convergence of all of these things, I thought made this a very Northlandia story to tell. And we really appreciate Dan and CHS for accommodating our reporting, which I will use that mention to put in a pitch if anyone is just listening to this podcast and has not gone over to DuluthNewsTribune.com to see Wyatt's fantastic photos and video. Also some great photos by our colleague Jed Carlson, who went up there. It is definitely worth seeing the fantastic images that they captured of this tree.
Yeah, most of the photos were by Jed, but I took a couple of photos with the drone because they were kind enough to let us fly the drone to get a couple aerials of the tree, which is, again, you head to the article to be able to check those out as well as the video. And then one other fun question I thought I'd mention here was, well, it was actually a reverse question. Dan asked us a question. We were going down the elevator because, adding more to the Christmas theme of the Northland here. We've had a couple Christmas movies filmed here with Merry Kiss Cam and Rescuing Christmas, and Dan inquired about if the grain elevator Christmas tree is in either of those movies. We'd have to look back to see for sure if they're in there. My guess would be no, because they were not filmed in the wintertime when the lights would have been on. But you never know. You never know. If you're a listener and you take the time to watch the movie, let us know if it's actually in the movie. My guess would be no, but that was an interesting question because it is, a Northland staple as it's now been along for so many decades now, much longer than I've been alive.
Yeah, I certainly have not noticed the tree in any movie made in Duluth, but here is an seed of an idea for any filmmakers who are planning to make Christmas movies in Duluth in the future, or in Superior, for that matter, which is where the CHS grain elevator is located. Anyone coming to the Northland to make a Christmas movie, here's a free idea. Instead of just another shot of the lift bridge and the icy canal, which is, that's great too, get that. But also, consider crossing the bridge and getting some images of this Christmas tree on top of a grain elevator on the Duluth Superior Harbor. That is a very, very Duluth Superior Christmas image that you can include in your movie.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jay. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm curious to see where we go next and maybe where we end up a year from now. If we have another holiday-themed episode around this time, you have a year to figure it out.
Yeah, and if anyone is listening and you have an idea for a Christmas-related story or holiday-related story that fits the Northlandia mandate of being something distinctive about this region, either a person, a place, a tradition, maybe something from history, if there is something about Christmas or the holidays in the Northland that you think would be a good subject for a feature, we would love to hear about it. You can write to northlandia@duluthnews.com.
All right, Jay, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy holidays, Wyatt, and happy New Year.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos by Jed Carlson and video produced by myself, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber of the Duluth News Tribune at duluthnewstribune.com/subscribe. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss. We're now in the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.